ever wondered why some people seem to have a gift for music? Have you ever wished that you could play by ear, sing in tune, improvise and jam? You're in the right place. Time to turn those wishes into reality. Welcome to the Musicality Podcast with your host, Christopher Sutton.
Hi, this is Christopher, founder of Musical You, and today I'd like to talk about the little why and how it can help you to avoid frustration and wasted effort in your music learning. We've talked here on the show before about staying motivated and taking a long-term view, how you need to know where you're trying to get to and why to find success in your music training and keep at it. I'll put a link in the show notes to a few past episodes on this in case you missed them. Inside Musical You too, we focus quite a lot with new members on getting them 100% clear on their big picture vision, as we call it, and their primary training goals, so that any modules they choose to take are going to effectively lead them towards those goals. And we make sure that the training program is personalized and adapted to suit their actual motivations in joining Musical You in the first place. You can think of all of this as the big why. The why that drives and guides it all in your musical life. But today, I wanted to talk about the smaller scale of remembering your motivation, the little whys. We recently had a Q&A call for our Foundations of a Musical Mind course, where students could come along live and get answers to their questions from me and Anne Molesky, our course instructor. And one of the students on the call, a chap by the name of Steve, was asking a question about form. There was an exercise in Module 4 of the course, which referred to a song being in AABA form. Now, if you aren't familiar with that kind of form labeling, it's really simple. AABA just means that the song does one thing, we'll call it A, and then it does the same thing again, so we say A again, AABA. It gives you a sense of the structure of repetition and variation in a piece of music. And Steve was pointing out that actually in this song, the fourth line was a bit different from the first two. One of the rhythms was different. And he was asking, should this be called AABC instead of AABA? We had an interesting discussion on the call about that, and the quick factual answer to his question was that we might actually call this last line an A variation, or mark it as A prime, but it's also fine to just call it A. And this led to the more interesting underlying point, which was that it really depends why you're figuring out the song form in the first place. One thing I love about working with adult learners at Musical U, and especially in our Foundations course, is that adults have a bit of self-awareness and a bit more determination to do things their own way. And while that can make it a bit like herding cats to try to provide training that works for all of them, it also leads to really fruitful and often quite deep conversation about how music is put together and how all the various areas of music theory and different traditions of music education work, or, as is often the case, don't work. So what I said to Steve on the call, because I thought it was an important bigger picture point, was that we need to remember to ask ourselves why we're labeling the form. We aren't doing it to get a question marked correct in a music theory exam. In the context of the Foundations course, we're doing it so that we can then improvise or compose variations on that song, so that we're building up our actual understanding of how the song's put together. And once you remind yourself of that, it's easy to see the answer to his question. You can call the fourth line A, you can call it A variation, you can call it C, or even Jeff. As long as your labeling is clear and serves you in the way you'll actually be using it, then that is the correct answer. Now, it is good to know the right answers, as it were, and to use standard terminology. So I don't mean to suggest that Steve was wrong in any way to wonder about how best to label the form. But I think we often get tripped up thinking that we must learn these things just because we should know them, and that we're only doing music right if we're ticking the officially correct boxes and doing what we should. And that can lead to us actually missing the point of it all. This is really an underlying principle throughout the Foundations of a Musical Mind course, that although we do teach terminology and ways of applying the core skills, such as improvising, singing, composing, collaborating, and more, it's the internal frameworks of understanding, the mental models, that matter the most. Because once you have those in place, all the rest, all the applications on your instrument, all the learning of theory, jargon, and so on, all of that follows smoothly and easily. So there are 2 points here that I wanted to share with you today. The first is this specific comment that focusing on the inner frameworks, the mental models, your understanding of music, can make it a lot easier, or even unnecessary, to learn particular skills or memorize rules or study up on theory. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, then you won't be surprised to hear me say that. It's the inner skills of music that set you free. And the second point is a more general one, which is to make sure to be frequently asking yourself, why do I want to learn this? You don't want to be constantly second-guessing yourself and changing course in your learning, of course, but I've seen far too many musicians spend far too much time and waste far too much energy going down rabbit holes or getting all worked up about resolving some intricate detail of music theory in their mind, when actually, if they stopped to remind themselves of their goals and their interests in music, and shake off the obligation that you should learn it just because it's there, or just because the establishment says it's important, then of course you must study it, they might realize that they've actually already grasped what they really need to, and could spend their time and energy much more usefully elsewhere. There's value in systems which have stood the test of time, and there's value in having a teacher or a coach guide you in your training. But our learning should never be blind and unthinking, and particularly as adult learners, we must make sure to remind ourselves we're learning for a reason, we have a motivation in mind, and remembering that motivation often brings simplicity and clarity to our learning in a way that nothing else can. So ask yourself that little why regularly, as in, why am I learning this? To make sure that you're never putting in effort just because, but instead, your learning is all on point and will deliver what you want most in your musical life.
Thank you for listening to the Musicality Podcast. This episode has ended, but your musical journey continues. Head over to musicalitypodcast.com, where you will find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive for podcast listeners. That's musicalitypodcast.com.